Hello everyone, welcome back to Systemic Embryology sessions. So today's topic is on aortic arch arteries. In previous session you might have seen the development of heart and heart tubes. So if you happen to see the topic, this topic would be definitely easier for you. So here this is the dorsal view of embryo where you are seeing the cranial part of developing embryo, and this side is the sagittal view of embryo. We can see it is partly getting folded here, and this is the cardiogenic area where it develops into heart tube, and we can see the development of blood vessels by means of vasculogenesis, where the process of formation of new vessels which are from the angioblast or specialized mesenchymal cells, and the mesenchymal cells differentiate into angioblast cells. These are angioblast cells, and which form later isolated angiogenic cell clusters and cords, and the lumen appears in these clusters and cords, and the primitive blood vessels are formed. The angioblast flatten to form the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. So the primitive blood vessels get interconnected with each other to form the network of endothelial vascular channels, which you can see in this image. And because of hemodynamic and genetic factors, certain channels enlarges to form blood vessels, and channels connected between them forms the branches or tributaries of veins, while the other channels will disappear. The next process is angiogenesis. Angiogenesis, in this process, the formation of new vessels by building a branch of pre-existing vessels. So first vasculogenesis occurs where a blood vessel will form, and from the blood vessel, a pre-existing blood vessel, a new blood vessel appears, that is called as angiogenesis. It is like vessels sprouting into the adjacent areas by endothelial budding and fuse with the other vessels. In this process, it results in a permanent vascular system is formed finally. So the primitive blood vessels cannot be distinguished structurally as arteries and veins. However, they are named according to their future fate and relationship to the heart in extraembryonic mesoderm. So vasculogenesis occurs first with extraembryonic visceral mesoderm around the yolk sac on day 17. So by day 21, vasculogenesis extends into extraembryonic somatic mesoderm located around the connecting stalk to form the umbilical vessels and secondary villi, and further to form tertiary villi. Vasculogenesis occurs in extraembryonic mesoderm, which differentiates into angioblast and which forms the cluster of angiogenic cells, and these angioblasts located in the periphery of angiogenic cells will give rise to endothelial cells which fuse to form blood vessels. In the intraembryonic mesoderm, the blood vessels form within the embryo from same mechanism as extraembryonic mesoderm. Eventually, the blood vessels formed in the extraembryonic mesoderm become continuous with the blood vessels within the embryo, so thereby establishing a blood vascular system between the embryo and the placenta. Hematopoiesis, that is the blood cell formation, first occurs within the extraembryonic visceral mesoderm around the yolk sac during third week of development. And during the process, angioblast within the center of the angiogenic cell clusters give rise to primitive blood cells, and which that is about the initial stage. And at the beginning of week 5, hematopoiesis is taken over by the sequence of embryonic organs like liver, spleen, thymus and bone marrow, which forms the blood cells. So this is a basic idea about the vasculogenesis and angiogenesis, how the blood vessels will develop, what are the two procedures and how the blood vessels are forming in both extraembryonic and intraembryonic mesoderm. So let's begin with the actual today's part, that is aortic arch arteries. So the arteries of the body develop from two main sources, pharyngeal aortic arch arteries and dorsal aorta. So we can see here the dorsal aorta. So these are right and left dorsal aorta. And we can see the dorsal aorta is connected to the truncus arteriosus by means of aortic arch arteries. First image shows the first pair of aortic arch arteries, and we can see in the second image the third and fourth pair, second, third pairs of aortic arch arteries. So here are the pharyngeal arch arteries. So just next to the paraxial mesoderm, the primitive aortae appear present on each side of the notochord, and these are the paired dorsal aortae which run through the entire length of the embryo initially. Eventually, the caudal portions of the aorta will fuse to form a single thoracic and abdominal aorta. So the caudal portions of it, they will join here, these two, to form the abdominal or thoracic aorta. And due to the craniocaudal folding of the embryo, the heart tube lies ventral about the septum transversum. Developing heart tube is connected to the dorsal aorta by means of pharyngeal arch arteries or aortic arch arteries. So primitive aorta is developed from mainly three parts, that is ventral aorta. So here we know this is the ventral aorta, and dorsal aorta, and first aortic arch artery. So the part lying ventral to the foregut, so the yellow one is the foregut, developing foregut. So this is the foregut, where we can see the pharyngeal arches developing within the foregut. So the part lying ventral to the foregut will form the ventral aorta. The part lying dorsal to the gut is called dorsal aorta, and the arched portion connecting between the ventral and the dorsal aorta lies in the first pharyngeal arch, and it forms the first aortic arch artery. After fusion of two primitive heart tubes, the two ventral aorta partially to form the aortic sac. So we can see the aortic sac as well. This is the aortic sac. So the unfused parts of the ventral aorta forms right and left horns of aortic sac, which I will show in the next image. So as the pharyngeal arches, so this is one side of the pharyngeal arches showing the pharyngeal arch arteries. So as the pharyngeal arches develop from the fourth to fifth weeks, each arch is supplied by an artery, and the pharyngeal arch artery derived from the aortic sac. So here is the aortic sac. We can see this is the first pharyngeal arch artery. Here is the second, third, fourth, and fifth one disappear and disintegrate. So sixth will be there. So that is the aortic sac contributes a branch to each new arch as it forms. Thus the aortic sac gives rise to 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries. The fifth pair appears initially, and later it disappear and degenerate, and these pharyngeal arch arteries develop within the pharyngeal arches during the fourth week, which are from aortic sac. So aortic sac develops from cranial part of truncus arteriosus of the heart tube. Aortic sac is connected to the dorsal aorta on each side by 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries. The aortic arch arteries are embedded in the mesenchyme of the pharyngeal arches on each side, connected to the aortic horn with the dorsal aorta of corresponding side. So that is about the aortic arch arteries. So let's see the each arch artery. So we can see first, second. So this is the aortic arch. Here you can see the aortic sac. This is the aortic sac, where it is bifurcating here to form aortic arch arteries. So this is the first one, second, third, fourth, fifth one disappears. This is the sixth aortic arch artery. So most of these arteries disappear, but remnants of them forms a part of maxillary artery in first aortic. So the first aortic arch artery will form the part of maxillary artery, which supply the ears, teeth, muscles of eyes, and also the masticatory muscles. Later this artery joins with the developing external carotid artery to form a branch of it. So we can see the external carotid artery here. Next, regarding the second arch arteries, the distal part of these arteries persists and forms the stapedial arteries. So the second arch artery, the distal part alone, it persists and it forms the stapedial arteries. Next, regarding the third arch forms the common carotid artery and internal carotid artery. So this is the third arch. The proximal part will form common carotid and distal part will form internal carotid artery. So we can see the proximal part will form common carotid and the distal part will form internal carotid artery. Next, fourth arch arteries. The fourth arch artery on the left side, it forms a part of aorta, and on the right side it forms a part of right subclavian trunk. So we can see here on the left side, because the arch of aorta is on left side. So this is the aortic arch from here to here, that is from the aortic sac till the opening of subclavian artery on the left side is derived from the left fourth aortic arch artery, whereas on the right side it forms the subclavian. This is the it forms the right subclavian artery on the right side. Fifth aortic arch arteries, we know they completely degenerate, disappear, and sixth arch arteries gives rise to pulmonary trunks on each side. So the proximal part on the left side will form the pulmonary trunk and distal part will form ductus arteriosus. Ductus arteriosus is a communicating channel between the left pulmonary artery and aortic arch artery during the fetal life. Because fetal life, it is both mixed blood, supplies the whole fetus. Later after birth, this ductus arteriosus, it gets obliterated and it forms ligamentum arteriosum after birth. On the right side, the proximal part of the sixth arch artery will form the right pulmonary trunk, whereas the distal part will disappear completely. The sixth arch artery, the distal part will disappear completely. So that is the development of aortic arch arteries. So the distal part of it on the left side forms the ductus venosus, and the right side the distal part disappears completely. So that is about the aortic arch arteries. So here is a beautiful tabular column for you to understand. So we will see the adult arch arteries and what are the sources of development. So arch of aorta is from aortic sac, ventral part of aortic sac, left horn of aortic sac and the left fourth arch artery. These are derived from the arch of aorta. Brachiocephalic artery is derived from the right horn of aortic sac. Right subclavian artery is proximal part is derived from the right fourth arch artery. We just saw it, whereas left side it forms arch of aorta. The distal part of the subclavian artery is derived from the seventh cervical intersegmental artery. Next, about the left subclavian is from, there is no arch artery to give rise to left subclavian. So it is derived from the left seventh cervical intersegmental artery. Common carotid, third arch artery proximal to the external carotid bud. Internal carotid from the third arch artery distal to the external carotid bud. And external carotid artery develops as a separate bud which from the third arch artery, which arises from the third arch artery by means of angiogenesis. And pulmonary artery is part of the sixth arch artery between the pulmonary trunk and the branch of lung bud on each side. And descending aorta, that is descending aorta is fused part of the dorsal aorta on the caudal side. So the proximal part of the left dorsal aorta distal to the attachment of fourth arch artery and distal part of fused aorta forming a single median thoracic and abdominal aorta. So one thing to remember here, students, So the arch of aorta also gets contribution from the left dorsal aorta between the attachment of 4th aortic arch artery and 7th intersegmental artery. So this completes overall idea about the aortic arch arteries and sources of development of aortic arch arteries. So let's see some congenital anomalies associated with this. First one is the double aortic arch artery. So you can see the aortic arch artery from 4th side. Double aortic arch results from the abnormal persistence of distal part of the right dorsal aorta, and it leads to the formation of double aortic arch artery, and which forms a vascular ring around the trachea and esophagus and cause the compression. So we can see the double aortic arch artery causing the compression of trachea and esophagus. This is the normal side which I have shown in the previous image. This is how we can see the double aortic arch compressing the trachea and esophagus, causing dyspnea and dysphagia. Next is about the abnormal subclavian artery. So abnormal origin of right subclavian artery. It happens due to the disappearance of right 4th aortic arch artery, so proximal to the right dorsal aorta. So in this case, the right subclavian artery, you can see here, the right subclavian artery, it forms from the distal portion of the right dorsal aorta, and the right intersegmental artery, that is the right intersegmental intersegmental subclavian artery. So you can see here the right intersegmental subclavian artery, and it is directly arising from the right dorsal aorta. So giving rise to abnormal subclavian artery. So because of the absence of this one, abnormal disappearance of the 4th arch artery on the right side, it forms the right subclavian artery abnormally arises from the dorsal aorta. Next condition is abnormal subclavian artery crosses the midline behind the esophagus. We can see here right subclavian, it crosses behind the esophagus and the trachea, creating a vascular ring and causing the compression of this esophagus and trachea. Next, here is an image to understand the main branches of embryonic dorsal aorta. So this is the dorsal aorta. So the dorsal aorta on the abdomen side, it forms the primitive, where the caudal parts of the aorta will fuse to form the primitive dorsal aorta, which forms the thoracic and abdominal aorta here. And we can see it gives rise to ventral splanchnic branches which supply the gut. So the ventral splanchnic branches, initially there will be several splanchnic branches, and most of them will disappear and degenerate, and remaining only three unpaired ventral branches, which are celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery, which supply foregut, midgut and hindgut. Next, on each side we can see the lateral splanchnic branches, which forms the phrenic and renal arteries. And when ventral, already I said, it forms celiac trunk, superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric, and also the bronchial branches and esophageal branches. And somatic intersegmental artery, this is the somatic intersegmental artery, will give rise to intercostal and lumbar arteries. So these are the main branches of embryonic dorsal aorta, how they develop into adult arteries. Derivatives of dorsal aorta. So embryonic artery, adult artery. So posterolateral somatic intersegmental branches. The arteries of upper and lower limbs and intercostal, lumbar and lateral sacral arteries are from intersegmental. Then lateral splanchnic arteries, just before I shown you, it forms the phrenic artery supplying the diaphragm, renal and suprarenal arteries and gonadal arteries as well. Then ventral splanchnic arteries will form to the gut, they are from vitelline and umbilical arteries, forms the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, and also internal iliac arteries, a portion of internal iliac, superior vesical artery, and medial umbilical ligaments it forms in adults, which contains medial umbilical arteries. So let's have one question, multiple choice question. Artery of the third arch. What is the artery of the third arch? So I hope you all know the answer. Maxillary, stapedial, common carotid, pulmonary trunk. So the third arch artery forms from the common carotid. It is from the common carotid artery, and it also forms the internal, distal part of it will form the internal carotid artery, both on right and left side. So, and here is the next question on aberrant subclavian artery formed due to. Aberrant subclavian artery is formed due to persistence of A, this is persistence of this one, persistent of B, persistent on obliteration of persistence of A and obliteration of B, obliterate A and persistent B. So I hope you could answer this. The aberrant subclavian artery, the right fourth aortic arch proximal. So the answer is obliterated A. The A should get obliterated, and the B part will be persistent. And here the intersegmental artery, seventh intersegmental artery connects to form aberrant right subclavian artery. So the right fourth aortic arch artery and proximal fourth portion of right dorsal aorta disappears, and distal portion of the right dorsal aorta, that is B, persists. So proximal portion A should disappear and distal portion B should be persist. In this case, the right subclavian artery is formed by distal portion of right dorsal aorta, that is persistence of B, and right seventh intersegmental artery. Since this abnormal artery crosses the midline behind the esophagus and trachea, forms a vascular ring. So a vascular ring is formed by right subclavian artery and aortic arch, which may compress the two visceral tubes, that is trachea and esophagus. Normally the right subclavian artery is contributed by the proximal to distal by the right fourth aortic arch artery. So this one normally it is contributed by right fourth aortic arch artery and also the right seventh intersegmental artery. These two arteries gives rise to that is right subclavian artery. So this completes the development of aortic arch arteries. Thank you.